So now it's time to make a cigar. Jaime's passing around. So those are the same cigars that came out of those little Puritos. It's a Seiko, a Viso, and a Ligero. I told you guys that the textures are thinner, medium, and thick. That gives you a chance to actually touch it and feel that thin, medium, thick. And then for you guys that have cigars, you can smoke it. So the factory needs to make brand A. Any brand you want, but brand A. Brand A has a very specific recipe. A typical cigar could have anywhere from really minimum, in my opinion, of 4 leaves, typically 5, but it could have as many as 8, depending on how thick it is. Your Coronas may be 4 leaves, your Robustos 5 leaves, your 6x60s can get up to 8 leaves. And when I say 8 leaves, that's 1 wrapper, 1 binder, and then the difference is the number of filler leaves. So they'll go and get the tobaccos they're going to need, either from a freshly just finished fermented polone of tobacco or from the bale. They'll break it up into little kits that will make 50 cigars. So have all the ingredients, just like if you were making pancakes and somebody said, here's the exact amount of flour you need, here's the exact amount of sugar. They do all the measuring for you. The cook's just putting it together. And that's the roller and the buncher. They work together in the cigar making process. And those teams, as they work, get enough materials at a time to make 50 cigars. Each team can make 300 cigars a day, but they only get it in allotments of 50. And the reason being is the recipe calls for exact use. A half a leaf of this, 1 leaf of this, 1 leaf of this. And as he or she is making the bunch, making the cigars, their material pile should be going down in perfect order. If they get to 50 and there's something left, or they get to 48 and something's already gone, then we know we have a problem. And it's better to know that on cigar 40 instead of cigar 90. And the supervisors were coming around the floor, checking the cigars they've rolled, but also just making sure that the materials are getting used correctly. And that's really the first step in consistency and quality control of cigar making. They know what brand they're making. They know exactly how much to use of each thing. But more importantly, they even know how each leaf goes into the bunch. So let's talk about the buncher and the roller and the bunch and the wrapper. Have you already disassembled something? Okay. So Jaime's going to actually deconstruct a cigar. And the first thing he's going to do is take the wrapper off. And now we are left with the binder. Again, that's picked for its beauty. So now Jaime's going to take the binder off. That's actually applied similarly to how the wrapper is applied. And again, that's picked for its kind of thickness and its integrity, because it's going to ultimately hold all those fillers together. Now you have the bunch, which usually starts at the base.
Yeah.
So now Jaime's going to actually open up the bunch. There's probably about 3 different tobacco varietals in the bunch, held together with like a base leaf, which is kind of similar to a binder, but it's going to help kind of keep the bunch together. So Jaime, I don't know if you can take it apart and actually bunch it.
What's that one called again, the one after the binder?
Well, it's just the fillers inside, but one of the fillers is called the base, because what Jaime's going to do, if he's rolling the cigar, he's going to take what's called the base leaf and lay it in his hand like this. And then he's going to actually fold the tobacco like an accordion. So Jaime's going to take that apart and show you how the buncher will actually build the bunch in his hand. But if you imagine that this is just a giant tobacco leaf, I mean, the real trick in this, right, is how does the draw continue? You're bunching this by hand. You don't want to affect the draw. So what they'll do is they do what's called an accordion bunch. There's various bunching techniques. They may roll these into little tubes and then place them. The more common is called the accordion technique, where they will fold the tobacco like an accordion and then lay it in a base leaf in their hand. And then they'll do another one and lay that one. And then they will take it and form the bunch. Then they take the bunch and they roll it in the wrapper. And then they take that, or the binder rather, and then they take that and roll it in the wrapper. But the cigar will taste totally different. They have to follow the instructions exactly. Depending on where that leaf gets put and placed in the bunch will affect, the actual overall performance and flavor. So if one team doesn't put the ingredients together in the right order, you've got a consistency problem.
Do you prefer the hand bunching or
I personally prefer the rolling machine. It's not really a machine, but it's what's called Libram. It's like a big cigarette roller where they lay the binder in, and then once they've made their bunch, they place it in and they pull a lever and it'll roll that binder. The reason being is because the machine itself, or the bunching Lieberman is what they call it, provides perfectly even pressure. And so you actually have a better quality cigar. Obviously, if someone's doing that by hand, you have different people that have different kind of, hand pressure. So you do get a little bit more inconsistency. But even if we're using that, it's not actually an automated machine. We still call that a handmade cigar. So
What keeps the cigar together?
So the binder is what holds those three, the filler tobaccos in place. And that's why we picked it for its heft and integrity. So like I said, after we bunched a few of our accordion and made our bunch in our hand, and we want to go ahead and roll it, we lay our binder down, and now we roll the binder, and you get left with what begins to start to look like a cigar. An ugly cigar, but a cigar nonetheless. From here, we'll put it into a mold and a press to kind of help give it that shape, and then it goes to I'm the buncher. Then I send my mold when it's done pressing to the roller, and they take that beautiful leaf and cut away some of the edges and pass that final piece of tobacco, which gives it that beautiful look.
How would you explain the draw of a cigar and what can go wrong in the cigar when the bunching and
Well, some people have draw masters, which helps. So before maybe it gets to the roller, there are these kind of machines that will gauge the pressure, kind of pull air through the bunch before we roll it, or before we apply the wrapper to see if there's a problem with it. And it's a great question because, we're talking about stuffing all these tobaccos in here and rolling this. If something gets knotted, what you end up with are burn problems, not combustion problems. Combustion would be an issue that the tobacco just won't burn, which usually has to do with it being under fermented. Burn problems tend to be because the bunch is not made correctly, or there's a problem in the bunch where there's a tight spot on one side, so the cigar starts to burn sideways. Or maybe they put the thinner tobaccos in the middle, and when they do that, you tunnel. The cigar will burn in the middle, and that's because they didn't place the leaves in the right order. And conversely, you can have a giant kind of cone burn where the wrapper and binder are burning too fast. That's because the opposite problem. They put the heavier tobaccos too much on the outside. So usually, though, go ahead.
So is there one problem that's more common than another? Because I know we get customers all the time oh, this tunnel, this did this.
Yeah.
Is there one that's okay, it probably didn't happen?
Right, of course, yeah. You have people that just want to game the system. I'll tell you that the rejection rate or the rate on non-Cuban cigars that are going to have problems is about 2 to 3%. So, but as a customer, you spent $200 on this beautiful box of cigars. Obviously, there's an expectation that they're all going to perform.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's no way that we know. Now, if you're going into a cigar store and you want to buy a cigar, there are things you can check, which I'll show you. We did that accordion bunch, right? And I made my bunch. And I'll take another piece of tobacco, quote unquote tobacco. And we're going to smoke this, I hope. Okay, so here's my second leaf. I place it in my bunch. Okay, now I've got kind of wild ends here on either end, and I need to give it more of its shape. So I've got about an inch, maybe 2 inches of extra tobacco up here. So what I'm going to do, and this is not actually tobacco, but if it were, it would be dry, and I could literally just take this and break the top off. And the way I would break it would be just like that. I'd take the top of my hand, and I'd break the top of the tobacco. Then I'd take these smaller pieces and fill it in where there's little gaps to give it kind of that uniform fold. What's interesting is this part of the leaf that I just broke off, right here is going to be the end that you cut, the head of the cigar. And if you notice in my hand, I broke the tobacco straight backwards. If, while I'm doing this, I twist just a little bit as I break, I'm going to create a knot right about where the cigar, this is right about where the cigar band is going to go. So usually when you have a draw problem where it's not drawing enough, or you have a problem where it's not burning right because of a draw problem, it's occurring right around where the band is. And a lot of people notice that when they touch it, they'll go, oh, it feels like there's a knot here. And that's when you're buying a single cigar, whenever I pick one up and I'm thinking about buying it, I like to run and kind of pinch top to bottom, but I'm always paying a little bit of attention here. If it's hard right here, it's because when that guy broke the bunch, he didn't do it straight, and there's a good chance it's going to have a problem. So when Jaime goes over and he's spot checking cigars, and we have an order of 20,000 cigars coming, he doesn't go do this to 20,000 cigars, but he'll pull a random sample of maybe 200 or 300, and he will give it what we call a field test. Probably 10% of them he'll have a concern about. So we'll separate out of the 300 he does with his hands, we'll pull 30. And he could kind of tell maybe something's up here. Then we will randomly draw test these to get a feel for the rejection rate. And the hope is at the end of the day, of the 300 he tests, that we don't have an instance really of more than 2 or 3%, which is kind of that average. If we do have a problem, then we've got a big problem, and we're going to work with the factory we're not going to accept cigars. And a lot of times what we do to give you guys great prices to pass them along to your customers is we're buying lots of cigars that people, maybe there was a customer who didn't pay, and now the factory needs to sell them to us, and we'll get a great deal, and these are great cigars. Sometimes they're bad batches, and they say, oh, the customer didn't pay, they're great cigars. Oh, really? We'll be the judge of that. And then once we do our kind of spot check, hey, this is kind of in the range of what we like, and we negotiate the price. So just a kind of a little tidbit about where you can usually identify a problem with a cigar and the reason why it happens.
Also, we can talk about
What's that?
we can talk also about when it's tight, when it's poured,
What's that?
when it's closed. You can talk about when it's closed too. The pores.
I don't know what you're talking about, but why don't you go ahead and explain it?
I was just telling Alex about you can by looking at a cigar, you look at the foot of the cigar too, and you can tell if you may or may not have a draw problem before lighting it. So one of the first things you do before smoking a cigar, you cut it, right? So you cut it. Your first thing you should do is you do a dry drop.
Dry drop.
You can tell right there, but usually you won't really know the absolute truth until you light it. But another way to find out really is by looking at the foot of the cigar. If you see this cigar right here, it has pores. I mean, you can see, would be
Pores.
air. Yeah, would be air going into the cigar to be able to, airflow, to be able to burn. In many cases, especially at the factory production down there, we find instances when we check the cigars that you can see if I press a cigar like that, you could see just closes. So, but by just looking at the cigar, you're like, this is not gonna dry. When it's too close, it's too tight, you see there's no point for air flow to go into cigar. That's something you can look at it and tell.
And that's typically because the cigar was overpressed. They either made it too much tobacco, and then they stuffed it into a tight mold. And that's a very different, but it's also something that can happen and something that we're checking. So when we have the 30, we'll either put them through the draw master, we'll cut them and just give it the old dry draw test. But hopefully, if we're doing our job, you guys are getting less of those phone calls. So you can call and complain to him anytime you want. I'll be sure to give you his personal home phone number. Then from there, the cigars, because, as we start working with the materials again, we wet the tobacco a little bit because Obviously, the buncher is now starting to, or the buncher is starting to actually bend the tobacco. So once they do get the materials, you'll see they've got a little squirt bottle. They'll be rehydrating the tobacco to make it more pliable, more workable. And as we know, when you add water to tobacco, it starts to want to work again, starts to want to ferment. And now we've compressed it in a cigar. That's why we put them into cold rooms and aging rooms for usually anywhere from 30, sometimes depending on Maduros take, for instance, a little bit longer, anywhere from 30 to 90 days to let them cool down, settle down, certainly before we put them in cellophane. Because if they're wet when they go in the cellophane, they're going to be that humidity for a very long time. So after they've come out of the aging room, we'll kind of try to lay all the cigars together that were from the production. Usually there's a little bit of a range of colors. If you have 2 boxes of Macanudo Cafes, you may have a little bit of color variance between each box, but all the cigars in that box are going to be the same color, look identical. So we'll kind of sort everything by color to make sure cigars that all look as much the same as possible go in the same box. We'll box them or bundle them up, add the bands, ship them here, and that's been 2 years since we planted those seeds. So you see a lot of guys out there too be like, well, I age all my tobacco. All my tobacco is 2 years old. That's kind of a marketing gimmick, right? I mean, if they've done everything they're supposed to do, it should be 2 years old anyway. So, but I go back kind of what I said at the beginning, and when you kind of think about this 2-year process and the fermentation and the curing and really the fact that all of this is done by hand. I mean, none of it is, the tools you see these guys using are the same tools they were using 150 years ago. It's a knife and a wooden mold and a table. So when you kind of think about that, it's really unbelievable that